There needs to be popular culture that is anti-fascist. So I wish, since my talk is partly about postmodernism, the book by Jameson, back to the 80s. So I will read out part of the lyrics of Heaven 17, we don't need this fascist groove thing. Have you heard it on the news about this fascist groove thing? Evil men with racist views spreading all across the land. Don't just sit there on your ass. Unlock that funky chain dance. Brothers, sisters, shoot your best. We don't need this fascist groove thing. Popular culture is ahead of us. So maybe it's time to do the impossible and revive Heaven 17. But before I do, I'd like to talk with you about Frederic Jameson. Before I begin, a caveat. I was born in the USA, but emigrated when I was 12, and I was trained to be a scholar in Canada. So I never met Jameson, I never saw him speak, and I have no admiring anecdotes about him to share. I know there are people in here who do, and I don't have any. All I can say is I've read his work, and for this panel I reread most of Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism in order to think about Jameson's influence and legacy, or for some of us, the lack of both. As you'll see, I'm going to be a touch bratty about all this, which may not be in tune with what Adam and Mark do, who are going to be a lot better about talking about Jameson as an influence. But any discussion of legacy, particularly with respect to Jameson's most widely influential book and his status as an architect of critical theory, needs to take his writing seriously, as Jameson himself took seriously the thinking of those with whom he did not agree. So I will do that. Not everyone is taking this approach right now. The tributes to Frederic Jameson keep on pouring in. Many scholars who were profoundly influenced by and supported by Jameson have written admiringly of him, and for instance, as the Titan of theory in the United States. These pieces say that Jameson was the best mentor anyone could have, the creator of the world-famous literature department at Duke University. He is called, quote, probably the most creative Marxist thinker of our time, unquote, and, quote, the torchbearer of Marxist thought, even though he was not an activist and his work never became known to the greater public, unlike, for instance, Noam Chomsky, Hannah Arendt, or Angela Davis. One tribute by Robert Talley Jr. calls him arguably the leading cultural critic in the world. His death is called a shocking blow, unexpected, a disorienting blow like no other. This last said by Bill Brown in Critical Inquiry. Many of these tributes contextualize Jameson's body of work, focusing particularly on the political unconscious and to a lesser degree on the postmodernism book. They name as important to Jameson some of the theorists who were touchstones in the 1980s, when theory, broadly conceived, came to literature programs and changed graduate school forever. Names like Marcuse, Adorno, Derrida, de Man, Lukács, Bloch, Sartre, Benjamin. With some of these names comes the problem of socialism in America. Bruce Robbins points out in his essay on Jameson that it is a bit perplexing that there is such an outpouring of love for someone who was, unapologetically, a Marxist theorist who refused to create more accessible works. Robbins says this: the tidal wave of grief and appreciative anecdote that rattled the virtual foundations of the internet at his departure was therefore a bit of a mystery. And so I think it's worth asking, what is actually being mourned? Since Jameson's most influential work was done decades ago. Some of what is being mourned, I think, is a kind of American academy where the study of literature adopted a combination of philosophy and political theory and acquired significant cultural capital in doing so. In this context, some tributes to Jameson celebrate his method, but leave out a lot of his Marxism, because his theory of history is bound to create some discomfort in an America that rejected any real socialism. This last idea isn't mine, it's from Kristen Sartwell's discussion of authoritarianism in Jameson's work, and also from Rebecca Carl's analysis of Jameson's influence in China. Sartwell and Carl are onto something. And so we are also mourning method, The idea that we can study politics, society, and culture and say things about Marxism that can make us the subject of reverence and not the subject of vilification or cancellation, or as some of my colleagues at York University, but also in the United States, are about to find out, even losing your job. To keep things concise, I want to discuss 3 things in the Postmodernism book that render Jameson's legacy problematic for me, and explain why I and others turned towards cultural studies and away from Marxist literary theory, deciding in that turn not to be all that influenced by Frederic Jameson. These 3 things are cultural logic, the American star power, and the last thing that I just call Jameson gets it wrong. But don't get me wrong. I admire Jameson's learning and his seriousness. I wish I'd met him. But I'm ambivalent about much else to do with Jameson and what his legacy might be. So the first is cultural logic. I don't have any slides, so I'm just reading out. It's interesting going back to the Postmodernism book because it feels really dated. Jameson hammers away at the core argument for almost 400 pages. Postmodernism, which he regards as the aesthetic and cultural zeitgeist of the mid-1980s in art, architecture, film, and literature, is the superstructure for capitalism, the base, of course. Postmodernism itself is revealed to be really just late modernism, connected to a post-Fordist capitalism that has become a hegemonic world-shaping economics and way of thinking connected to globalization. Postmodernism provides the logic of no history, based on a non-foundation of unfixed meanings accompanied by a serious lack of politics because its incredulity towards meta-narratives ignores the meta-narrative of Marxism and its analysis of history, production, and class politics. It is lipstick on a capitalist pig, and it underwrites consumption as the hallmark of late capitalism rather than opposing its logic. I'm sure you've all read the book, so no quoting from it is needed. You'll remember that Jameson takes us through a dizzying tour of economics, culture, ideology, philosophy, literature, art, and lots of other things in order to prove beyond any doubt that postmodernism is bankrupting the study of history, society, and culture. But reading back now, I have questions about cultural logic in this book. Jameson is contemptuous of postmodernism in a specific way. He says that postmodernism is a consciousness industry centered not on film and not on literature, but on video and the idea of media. Jameson defends film and literature from postmodernist critique. There is no room for working class uses of culture in the book, so there is no room for Raymond Williams. And there is no room either for critiquing consumption as something worth looking at, so there is very little room for Walter Benjamin. The analysis is indebted to Adorno and Horkheimer's The Culture Industry, and so, like Toby Miller and his own earlier work on television, Jameson condemns new media as the opium of the people and not the people's culture, because it is propaganda doing damage to thought. Later on, Jameson did take SF, which is science fiction and the fantastic together, seriously as a way to imagine utopia, and he wrote a book about it. But that's not in the postmodernism book. So anyone interested in popular culture and in an idea of culture that requires us to restructure ideas about class and taste had to go to cultural studies, and especially to the Birmingham School to understand that. Marxist literary criticism just didn't have a lot to say about media, not at that point. 2, American star power, but you could call it academic star power. Frederic Jameson's championing of the theory industry in the United States put him at the center of a star system anchored there. But the world we're in isn't Jameson's world, not anymore. And as I'll suggest, maybe some of us never really were part of that world anyway. Case in point, thought about Jameson deflects frequently to the politics of the United States, often unconsciously as everyone's politics. For example, in David Carrier's tribute to Jameson, he suggests this, quote, "What has replaced postmodernism as a label for our period style is the awareness about race that was so presciently analyzed by W.E.B. Du Bois." Unquote. Such a statement that postmodernism simply gives way to an American awareness of American race issues ignores what postmodernism itself is. It has a history, it has a geography, and it's not an American movement. I know this because I took a first-year comparative literature course from a sessional lecturer, underpaid, unsung, who was called Linda Hutchin. That's who taught me about postmodernism, something she learned about because she could read the Italian architecture theorists, because her name was Linda Bartolotti and she was Italian. Unlike Jameson, Hutchin did try to speak about postmodernism beyond the academy and use it to construct a theory of political critique through the figures of historiographic metafiction, irony, and parody. Many of Hutchin's ideas about the innate politics of postmodernism, probably made as a response to Jameson, won't survive. I don't think the Politics of Postmodernism book is going to make it, actually. But the work of the Canadian postmodern, another book she wrote, maybe could. It does appear prescient right now. Postmodernism could be seen as a national position beyond the center, as well as a refusal to engage the center as a strategy. Always historicize. Postmodernism was not the same everywhere. Canadian discussions of postmodernism didn't look like Jameson's. They were often about locality. So think about the work of Robert Croach, who was a poet from Alberta, and about feminist and queer critiques of language coming from deconstruction that came from Europe via Quebec. And here I think of Barbara Goddard, Smaro Cambarelli, Nicole Brassard, Daphne Marlatt. Feminism and postmodernism in Canada really mattered in the 80s, politically, in the academy, and in the world beyond it. And so Jameson didn't have much to say to me because he universalized postmodernism in order to critique it. He wasn't talking to me, or about people like me either. Okay, third, Jameson misses the point. I know, it's going to be really bratty. But as I read through postmodernism, I was struck by how much is in the book and how much isn't there. Bruce Robbins points out that Edward Said, Jameson's contemporary, became an activist for people in Palestine. Even today, he is revered there. But Orientalism is a book that looks at its core, that at its core contains a deconstruction of empire and a critique of Occidental modernity, making it one of the most important source books for post-colonialism, a critique that certainly does have a politics. So why doesn't Jameson talk about it? The book rails against postmodernism as if post-colonial theory, feminist theory, even the beginning of critical race theory in the 1970s just don't exist. More than that, where is any discussion of postmodernism and political controversies, for instance, about the censorship of Robert Mapplethorpe's art, or, and this is a big one, neoliberalism itself? I remain gobsmacked that postmodernism is even the enemy. Neoliberalism is the enemy, and it sure looks like the cultural logic of late capitalism to me. How does Jameson not see this until 2007 when he publishes A Brief History of Neoliberalism, an essay? I don't know. And it gives rise to a tendency to just substitute neoliberalism for postmodernism in some of the criticism about Jameson, which admittedly is not his fault. But they are very different things, neoliberalism and postmodernism. Ronald Reagan, remember him, was the US president while Jameson was writing, and he famously kicks off neoliberalism in the USA, taking the cue from Margaret Thatcher. Cultural studies intellectuals in the UK did not hesitate to call out Thatcher for the proto-fascist neoliberal that she was, but Jameson didn't join in that. And then there's the AIDS crisis and the movement in the 1980s to critique homophobia and fight for queer life, sometimes using aspects of postmodernist thinking to dismantle meta-narratives about gender and sexuality. But Jameson in that big book decides to argue that suspicion of meta-narratives is the problem. In the end, postmodernism wasn't really much of an enemy to Marxism, and vice versa. Both of these currents of thought mostly have left the academy, although, I know we still do some of this work, but not the way that Jameson did it, I would say. So, what is Jameson's legacy going to be for us? I don't think that Jameson's critique of postmodernism is going to speak much to generations after my own, because of its preoccupation with something that really only was an academic fashion, a style, a period with a beginning and an ending. I had to look elsewhere for influences when I was starting out in the academic world. Perhaps you did too, or maybe you're a huge Jameson fan. No matter where you stand, let's talk about his legacy. That is what he would want. Thank you.